Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Milana. Start with the fact that CSR and ESG issues now feel like they're very mainstream issues, and particularly at the big end of town among the majors, international conferences held by the UN, other major institutions talk about these issues a lot. My first question is based around the fact that most of the mining industry aren't majors, and they don't go to these international high-level events, and yet the junior community is often the first face that a community in a remote part of the world will have, first contact they'll have with mining. So are we seeing all these high-level CSR issues and principles we should be adopting, are we seeing them trickling down through the industry?
Well, yes. We're not seeing it consistently, but we are seeing it, absolutely. And there's a few reasons for that. I think the first reason is, and I hope it's a big reason, is that people are recognising that it's the right thing to do, but there also is pressure coming on them from both investors, lenders, communities and governments. These days I think many of the requirements around getting licences, either to explore or in fact to mine, are dependent upon a variety of CSR requirements around community, around sustainability, around what is your actual plan for mine closure, however far away that might be. And we're finding, most importantly, I think, that particularly if you're a listed company, then it's going to be an expectation of your investors in a way that it wasn't even, say, 10 years ago. And I think we are therefore seeing that the things that are being put in place by the larger miners are trickling down to expectations on junior listeds as well, yes.
I would very much support that. As a partner in a law firm, I'm quite intimately connected with, for example, reporting of companies. And if you look at reports of mining companies maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there would be a lip service paid to environmental and social issues in a form of a sentence or two. Now you can find pages which are actually showing what the companies are doing and to what depth. And from my point of view, I would have thought that there is just such a raft of developments which occurred over the last 5 years or so, which is driving this behaviour. You may all have been confronted with Modern Slavery Act, for example, in the UK. Everybody said what an innocuous piece of legislation that is, how totally unenforceable. But the beauty of it was that it actually put the agenda under a very catchy phrase of modern slavery in front of directors in companies, and suddenly it got attention, and so companies started responding to that. There are wider obligations on reporting under the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which has been implemented into our law. And there are other developments which may seem far away and not necessarily relevant, but you may have heard about the drive which the Philippines Commission on Human Rights was, for example, trying to stage and is still in the process of going through, where they have asked, and the numbers differ all the time, but around 50 carbon majors to come and account for their impact on climate change. And they went at it from the human rights point of view. They said that the lives and rights to life, to health, to education, to housing, whatever, in the Philippines have been impacted. That's why they had a jurisdiction to call these companies to answer. And even though that particular commission doesn't have any right to ask for damages or anything like that, they are saying, or the Greenpeace, which has been driving this initiative, is saying that the very fact that there have been days when the Commission was listening to submissions, both from carbon majors, but also various witnesses, various experts, they have amassed a wealth of documents, information, which is going to be made available, and it is a testimony to what is happening. And I know from my own experience that companies which, even if they didn't want to necessarily engage with the process and had good reason why not to, picked up on the general trend and started doing more. And all of that is complemented by the stock exchange wanting issuers to report on ESG issues, on the credit rating companies actually incorporated ESG issues into their credit rating, London Metal Stock Exchange issuing guidance. So I have a feeling that there is just so much happening and so much noise and information that it would be very difficult for any company to totally ignore it and to adopt a position that it actually is not relevant to them.
Do smaller companies know what to do though? And I ask that from the point of view that a lot of junior companies, probably until they start building out development teams, they're small teams of technical people, they want to do the right thing, but often they don't know what to do, and we talk about ticking boxes like it's a bad thing, but a lot of smaller companies who want to do the right thing, they would just like to know what boxes to tick, what is doing the right thing, what does that look like? Can it be written into a mining code, or does it have to be a cultural change in the industry?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of carrot and stick, actually. I think that that having it defined is actually very helpful because it gives you the level playing field that people are very keen to have. And it also, I think if you are a junior, and absolutely you're probably a bunch of geologists or something, having someone tell you the sorts of things you should be considering, frankly, is quite helpful. So I think, yes, some box ticking initially. I mean, box ticking perhaps has got a bit of a bad name, but the fact is that if you do if the boxes that you need to tick have been properly thought out, there's no problem with that. And if it ultimately leads to cultural change, well, then you've reached your goal. So I think that the issue for the juniors is to have some consistency around what the requirements are. And we often are. We sometimes sort of pick on developing countries in Africa or South America, but actually, I mean, I'm Australian. The Australian government's been a bit hopeless. Well, it's not actually the Australian government, but the state governments in Australia have been a bit hopeless as well in terms of consistency and not continually changing the rules. So I think across the world, there is a need to have guidelines that are well thought out, that are clear, that are consistent, and that don't change all the time. And then the juniors and the larger miners can have something that they can work to.
Is that realistic to have international regulators aligned like that, or does it have to come back to the investment guidelines and regulations because that is international?
Well, you're never going to get countries to all agree with each other, but I think they do trickle down in the same way that large companies doing things trickles down, because if you look at mining codes in small countries, they are often based off mining codes of other countries that they've used as a basis. So there is a sense of trickle down there as well.
It's a question of cost, because obviously if you start looking at areas which are not necessarily the ones you have to go through in order to identify where you want to drill and how you are going to be doing it and preparing the company for an IPO, every penny counts. But at the same time, I think it could potentially turn to be a false economy, because by the time the companies do go to an IPO, these days the requirements of investors are so high that you have to have all your ducks in a row, and the sooner the process of, I don't want to necessarily call it compliance, but in a way it is, the sooner all these issues and non-financial risks are actually being taken into consideration, and the whole principles of the company built on that basis, the easier it is and the cheaper it is later on in the money-raising stage.
And how do you do that if you're a small company and you are just technical people? How do you find the resource to go and build out that infrastructure from day one when you're just a few people on a drill rig?
Well, it is difficult, but when there is a will, there's a way, and even those guys can actually learn some of the basic things, get some advice, and make sure that at least the basic principles are in order.
I mean, there's lots of people out there varying quality, but there's lots of people out there who'll give you advice if you want it. I think that the point is that if you are ultimately intending to list, or as we'll hear about later, intending to borrow from reputable lenders, you need to have this stuff in place because it's going to be a requirement as a listed company to be able to report on what you're doing in these areas.
Alluding to requirements for lenders, obviously we're talking about the Equator principles that Milana, you're the expert here, but my understanding is that they were updated yesterday, or the consultation process for updates started yesterday. Can you just start by giving us an idea of what those changes are likely to look like?
That's right. So the Equator Principles Association, which is an association of 97 banks who have signed up to a sustainability code, which basically means that borrowers are obliged to comply with certain principles which are presented to them. And unless they do, the banks have agreed amongst themselves that they are not going to lend the money. You are most likely going to be familiar with the main principle. At the moment, the version of Equator Principles which exists is version 3 from 2013, which was put together fairly shortly after the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have been adopted. And the association has been working on the update of Equator Principles with a view of introducing a new version, Equator Principles 4, by the end of this year. We have actually been advising on the legal side of it, so I will not be able to give you any insights because the transaction is still going on. But where we are in the process, the association has launched yesterday a public consultation on the changes. So if you go on the website of Equator Principles Association, you will find it there. You will be able to lend your voice. Basically, there are 4 main changes which are coming through. Very briefly, 2 of them are almost logistical, 2 of them are quite substantive. The logistical ones are looking at the scope of products which are subject to the Equator Principles. And there, the project-related corporate loans are actually going to kick in from a threshold of $50 million US. It used to be 100 million. So the proposal is that that threshold is going to be lowered by half. They are also introducing new rules for refinancing, project-related refinancing and acquisition finance, so that if you are actually refinancing a project which was subject to the Equator Principles rules to start with, the scope didn't change, and the project is still running, and you are asking for refinancing, then the same Equator Principles are going to apply to it. So that's the sort of scoping. Then there's a really sort of interesting change, even though that's voluntary at this stage. The way the principles work is that depending on where your mine, in your case, is in this situation, depending on the host country, if it is a country in one of the OECD countries, it's called a sort of designated country, and there the requirements are actually governed by local law of the host country. But if you are in other non-designated countries, you have to apply over and above the local law the IFC performance standards as well. And what the scoping is saying at the moment is that if you are actually doing your initial analysis and you find out that it is warranted that you would actually want to bring one of the Equator IFC performance standards into play over and above the host country laws, you can do that. So that's an interesting one. And then the two substantive areas are very consistently with the developments in this area around human rights and social impacts and around climate change. So in relation to human rights, there is actual acknowledgement in the principles, in the preamble, which is not that different to what it was before, but all the Equator Principles financial institutions are actually acknowledging that they are subject to the obligation to respect human rights in accordance with the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights. And you then go into a situation where originally the human rights were being looked at within the specific principles, like workers' rights and indigenous peoples and so on, as they are in the IFC performance standards. Now, the original assessment, if you are doing an environmental and social impact assessment, should actually include a human rights impact assessment, and depending on the levels of risk you are going to come up with as the result of the impact assessment, you then mitigate these impacts throughout the project. And the last one, climate change, I think there are just not enough words to stress just how important that topic is, what sort of consequences it has. The Equator Principles Association is very aware of that. Again, it's sort of bringing the Paris Agreement into play through the preamble, and it is mandating climate change risk assessment as part of the initial ESIA on the projects where it is relevant. So if you are looking at a project which is of a particular size, you're looking at analysis of the physical risks, and if there are certain thresholds in relation to CO2 emissions, you have to do an analysis of transition risks and the various scenarios as to how your greenhouse gases could be lower in different scenarios. So something very interesting, a step in the right direction. It is there, it is open for inspection and comments to everybody, and to the extent it is important to you and dear to your hearts, then please go on the website and see if you wish to comment as well.
It's quite a lot to take in there, Tim, but to put you on the spot, I know you haven't had a chance to review it all, but from looking at your clients, it sounds essentially, not to simplify it, sorry Milana, but it sounds like things are getting tighter, regulation is getting more intensive. How's that likely to affect the companies that you work with? Are people already moving in this direction,
Sure.
Or are they going to have to accelerate their changes?
Well, there's probably three things. There's regulation, but reporting requirements. I mean, that's a big one. But the other one, of course, is investors. I mean, if I go back to when I started my career, the time that you were confronted with, sort of sustainability questions was when you were walking to the AGM and there was probably some Greenpeace people protesting outside the AGM. Whereas now, it's the significant or the major institutional investors who are inside the AGM who are actually requiring these sorts of issues to be dealt with. So, I mean, everybody talks about, the Church of England pension fund. It's a good example because it's quite active in terms of talking about this. But even the very, very large institutional investors across the world are requiring companies to talk about what they're doing in the areas of sustainability, issues like modern slavery, which is also a regulatory requirement here in the UK, and their environmental questions, community questions, as I said at the beginning, life of mine questions. So they're being sort of, from all sides, but I think in a very good way. And the question, particularly for mining houses that are at let's say a more mature part of their life cycle, how they respond to that will determine how effective it is and also how beneficial it is for both sides. Because if you do it properly, it's a win-win. I mean, the best example, Chris, that I can think of is perhaps community relations. If you are a miner in a remote area and you have a community that you have got on side, perhaps through doing some useful things that are helpful to the community, then not only do yes, you might tick the box, but more importantly, you'll have a cooperative, happy, helpful community in which you're working, which is much better than having an aggressive community that other than the jobs you're giving them, doesn't, resents you being there. And that sort of adversarial relationship between miners and their, communities in which they're working, which has so often sadly been a problem, if you can do something useful that means that actually they appreciate the mining company being there, then everybody benefits.
It's all really about substantive mitigation of risks. I think the lenders have got a much better understanding of the risks and where they are coming from. And they understand, thanks to some litigation which is happening, that possibly they might be in the line as well as the mining companies. And so I think this particular framework is certainly not about making rules for the sake of making rules, because the banks obviously want to be competitive and they don't want to put extra barriers to funding. But at the same time, they are trying to find mechanisms how the issues are identified and they are addressed in advance so that they don't actually materialize. And it makes good business sense because the projects need to work and operate for the funding to be repaid. Any major problems request a lot of remediation cost on behalf of the mining company's management time. So it's really good business sense, and the whole drive behind it is to avoid maybe some of the disasters which we are actually seeing happening at this stage.
I've got some more questions, but I just wanted to see if there's any questions. It's quite a broad topic. Are there any questions that anyone else has that they want to jump in with now?
Thank you. Really good presentation. I'm going to speak up because I've been told that I should. So I just want to know how intelligent the conversations you're hearing on this subject are, because it's quite a complex issue, obviously. So, for example, you have a big, dirty diesel generator in Ivory Coast that you need to run your mine because the grid just isn't good enough to keep the mine up, and that's because the government hasn't invested enough in that. Or go down to South Africa and Eskom just aren't keeping up to speed with getting that infrastructure you need to bring a mine to account. If you then turn to the juniors and say, this is now your problem, is the conversation intelligent enough to bring good projects to account still that can provide benefits to communities, and not to say the corporates, this is all your problem now?
Shall I? Yeah, look, I'll give that. It's a very good question. And I think one of the things that miners are doing, and again, it's to your point around the larger miners and junior miners, there is an element of trickle down in this. But the mining houses are looking at using, developments in technology to, in a sense, help clean up their own footprint, as well as providing the materials for everyone else to clean up their footprints. And one of the things that is, in a sense, might seem a bit counterintuitive, is that as the world moves towards decarbonisation, as we sort of look at the transition to, less carbon intensive or zero carbon, ultimately, energy, you actually need more of what we do. Copper is the classic, you need so much more copper as you electrify everything. And that means you've got to dig more of it up. I mean, there's an element, obviously, of recycling, and we can get better at recycling, but, we need to do more digging of it up. So as the miners seek to provide those materials, they need to think about how they do it themselves. And your example of a dirty diesel generator is a classic. I mean, the miners, again, probably led by the majors, they all have their programs around, they either call it, the mine of the future, or I think future smart mining is what Anglo calls it. intelligent mine. I mean, they've all got a name, but what it really is about is trying to find ways to improve the way they mine, to reduce their impact, to find ways of reducing their energy requirements. I mean, there's a big push around, for example, reducing the need for truck movements by changing the way you mine, doing more things in pit and that sort of stuff. So there are, and if you look at South America, Chile is a good example where they are looking at ways of using much more renewable energy, so they don't need to use as much diesel. All of these things are going on, and the clever ones are doing it in ways where they can, if they find a way to use less energy, or they find a way to use renewable energy, then selling that or getting involved, adjacent junior miners who can then benefit from that as well. So it varies massively from country to country, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that the industry's got it all sorted, but it is a focus. It's an absolute focus, particularly, I think, those with more resource, pardon the pun, but the sensible ones are doing it in a way that they can bring in juniors and that they can benefit as well. And there's a very good reason for that. Apart from, that it's the right thing to do, it also means that their social licence to operate, their ability to demonstrate to both community and host government that they're doing these things is enhanced.
We had another question. Ian?
Hi, Ian Pickard from Strategia. How are I think I'll agree, Milana, that the EP4 is going to be more stringent, won't be a box tick anymore. But how are the funders going to get assurance that the companies are doing what they're saying they're doing? Are they going to take their word for it, or are they going to seek some form of independent assurance?
It is very different as to the practices which various lenders have in-house or not. There are some who have really developed teams. EDC has got 60 sustainability personnel in-house and can do an amazing analysis, which is probably as good as any engineer. There would be others who would be relying on independent third-party opinions. You have areas like the tailings dams where you are going into a real hard technical core sort of stuff where there are only certain specialist firms, as you know full well, who would be able to do that. And I think it will depend on the sophistication of the lenders and on the level of their requirements. And at the moment, I certainly see that where you go to the level of ECAs, and potentially DFIs, they have got very high standards. There are some really very sophisticated commercial banks with their own teams, and there would be some who will outsource the project. But I can't see at this stage, even on the basis of what is happening now, even before the new version is going to come up, that the lenders would actually take the word for it. I certainly see in the project finance practice that on the transactions where I am acting now, there is a definite move from a situation where you just had a condition precedent that everything had to be in compliance with IFC performance standards, and you delivered the documents which are part of the risk management system, and then you got your money. I think it is getting much more sophisticated. The lenders actually want to understand what is happening. They want a say. They want to be notified if new issues arise. They want to have established mechanisms, how you govern these issues, what is happening. And I think sort of rightly so, because ultimately they just want to be at the table to come to the right solutions. And so, because one understands how mines work, we are coming up with solutions which are making sure that it is not stifling the life of the mine, that not every time when a minute issue happens, you have to put together a corrective action plan. But then there are situations which are really very grievous, and you need to remediate straight away, you need to put in a big correction action plan, and there are sort of mechanisms how you can do that, and that's what the lenders are beginning now to ask of us, certainly.
That's beautifully timed, Milana. We're at 10 seconds. So thank you, Tim. Thank you very much, Milana. And yeah, back to Tom.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.